you. My name is Heaven Crawley. I'm Head of Equitable Development and Migration at the University for Policy Research in New York. And I'm really delighted to welcome you here to this online launch of the Refugee System, a Sociological Approach by Rowan Auer and David Scott Fitzgerald. Welcome to you in particular. Before I introduce the authors and say a few words of introduction, I'd just like to make a few housekeeping points and explain also the format of the event. Firstly, the event is being recorded, so just be aware of that. We wanted to record it so that we can share it online and other people can view it. But if you want to make an intervention, you want to remain anonymous, then just obviously change your name in the settings. Secondly, in terms of the format of the event, we'll start with an overview of the book's main arguments by the authors, and that will be followed by 3 responses from our very eminent panelists, who I'll introduce before they speak. And finally, provided that we keep our contributions focused, and I know there's a lot to say and a very short amount of time in which to do it, we'll have time for comments and questions from you, the audience. So you can type your comments and questions in the Q&A box, and then I'll ask these of our speakers. And if you want to remain anonymous, as I say, just change your name in the settings. So, housekeeping out of the way, without further ado, let's start. I'd like to begin first by introducing the authors of the book, Rowan and David. Welcome to you both. We're very delighted to have you here, and congratulations on the publications. I think this is the first event kind of launching the book, so we're very delighted that you decided to do it with us, obviously. Let me just introduce you both for our audience. Rowan Auer is Assistant Professor in the Department of Law, Societies and Justice at the University of Washington. She previously held a postdoctoral fellowship at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University. Professor Auer has published on refugee issues, migration and ethnicity in journals including the Annual Review of Sociology, the Journal of Middle East Law and Governance, Nations and Nationalism, and the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies. Welcome, Rowan. I'm very pleased to be having you here today. David Scott Fitzgerald, as many of you will know, is Theodore E. Gildred Chair of US-Mexican Relations, Professor of Sociology and co-director of the Center for Comparative Immigration Studies at the University of California, San Diego. Many of you be familiar with his award-winning books, including Refuge Beyond Reach, How Rich Democracies Repel Asylum Seekers, published in 2019, and I think that was the last book. Culling the Masses, the Democratic Origins of the Racial Immigration Policy in the Americas in 2014, and A Nation of Emigrants, How Mexico Manages Its Migration in 2009. It's really a huge pleasure to have you with us today as the authors of this book, and for us to have this opportunity to launch the book and to hear a little bit more about the work and your motivations, really, in a way, for writing it. Before I hand over to you, I just wanted to say just a few words of introduction, if that's okay, just to also give you perhaps a few reflections of my own on the contribution that I think the book makes, not just to think how we think about how best to understand and engage with the experiences of refugees, but also, in a way, what this approach of the refugee system has to offer to the ways in which the UN system, of which obviously I'm a part, through my own role, addresses the issue of forced migration. And I know you're going to tell us a lot more about the book, but for our audience, it really follows the story of how one Syrian family spread across several countries tried to survive the civil war and live in dignity. And I think in so doing, it really unpacks and contextualizes the very complex interconnections between the different factors that shape refugee decision-making, the journeys they make, and the places that they go. For me, reading the book really resonated because during the 2015 so-called refugee crisis in Europe, we were involved in a big project interviewing people as they were arriving on the shores of the Mediterranean. And a lot of those people were really reflecting on the long-standing historical relationships, for example, between Syria and Turkey, one of the countries from which people were traveling. So I think it was clear from my own research, and definitely clear from this book, that it's really impossible to understand the experiences of refugees or how to help them build a new life without understanding the historical context within which their migration takes place and the geopolitical relationships between the different countries involved, both historically, I think, and in the contemporary times. And what I really liked about the book, I'm not going to gush too much, but I really enjoyed reading it, is the way in which it really kind of humanizes and situates refugees. So rather than sort of abstracting them into these very isolated, separate individuals, it really kind of embeds them in the context within which they're migrating, and the kind of broader systems and the broader processes in which that migration is located. And I think because those processes that you describe in the book, those broader social processes of social, economic, and political change have been so rapid in many countries of the global south, particularly in the last few decades, this book really kind of offers a window into understanding those experiences in a much more contextualized way. And finally, and I suspect we'll also touch on this in our discussion today, I think it really encourages us, the book, to reflect on the ways in which knowledge about migration is constructed, and how and who and for what purposes that knowledge serves. And I think that because many of us are working in the academic space, including within the UN system, I think that really gets to the heart, if you like, of what it is that we do and why I guess it is that we do it. There's lots more I could say, I won't, but as I say, I really enjoyed reading the book. What I'm going to do instead is hand over to David and Rowan for them to tell us more about it and walk us through, if you like, some of the main arguments that you're making in the book for us all to kind of get that overview. David, Rowan, you've got about 25 minutes, I think we agreed. So hand over to you, and then after you've spoken, I'll introduce the respondents and we can go from there. Thank you.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much, Heaven, and thanks very much to our discussants, the UNU, for giving us the opportunity to spend the next 90 minutes together. And the question I always ask myself is, why are we here? Everyone is busy. This is not a pleasant topic. Why are we going to spend our precious time together talking about these issues? And Rowan and I are here because we would like to convince you that there is a problem with standard approaches to understanding issues around forced migration. And building on the work of a long line of scholars, including some people who are on this call, we offer a systems approach to understanding those issues that we think shows issues that would otherwise remain hidden. So what is the basic problem that we're trying to address with this book? It's a problem of silos, and already Heaven in her comment hinted at some of these problems. There are different ways that knowledge about forced migration and associated issues is siloed. I'm an academic, and we have different academic subdisciplines and sort of cross-disciplinary studies that are siloed. So we've got the silo of conflict studies, the silo of refugee studies, forced migration studies, studies of international migration, which were really created primarily to understand labor migrations. Then we've got the operational side. You haven't mentioned UN agencies. So there's the silo of what the UNHCR does, different than what UNRWA does with Palestinian refugees, the IOM, UN peacekeepers. We could think of other such examples. In the study of the law, there are different silos, right? There's humanitarian law, the law of war in one silo, then a silo for refugee law, immigration law. And often there are really good rationales for why those silos existed in the first place and why they might even exist today. So we're not claiming that everything needs to be broken down, that there should be no boundaries to knowledge. That would be impossible. What we're saying is that by deliberately trying to look at forms of knowledge that cross over and bridge these different silos, we can see things that we would otherwise miss. Next slide, please. So there are 6 fundamental ways that we see the production of knowledge around forced migration and related issues to be siloed. The first is what some people would call methodological presentism. What is that? Methodological presentism is the sense that everything is different now, that we're living in a time of unprecedented challenges. It's an approach that is so focused on the very understandable human needs that we're confronted with right now that we lose sight of the fact that we have often seen very similar things in the past, lose sight of our ability to distinguish what is really novel about the current situation, and to understand the why, to really focus on these historical explanations. The second way that we see as a characteristic of siloed production is a neglect of why people are moving in the first place. There have been various studies of media representations of asylum seekers or even resettled refugees that have found that there is precious little information in those accounts of why people left. These accounts fundamentally began when those individuals reached the front doors of the rich countries where the news is produced. And that's also true of a lot of humanitarian reports or reports, say, by the UNHCR. It's extremely informative and influential Global Trends report, which, for understandable reasons that we could talk about, says very little about why people are becoming refugees in the first place, right? There are political sensitivities around donors, around maintaining access to refugees by not upsetting governments that control that access and so forth. But the bottom line is that across many spheres, we see little information other than maybe, throwaway lines, war, poverty, persecution, about exactly what are the logics of why people are moving. And they're really complicated logics, as I'll explain in a moment. Then much does this work, again, because it's focused on real life problems right now, in which legal instruments are an important part of a policy toolbox, exclusively adopt a legal definition of refugees. And while that might be entirely appropriate for someone doing refugee status determination, for example, it really limits our understandings of other kinds of people who are mobile, who are forcibly immobilized, who cannot move even if they would want to. And it keeps us from seeing similar situations in the past of people who, with today's lenses, would be considered refugees, but they were moving at a time when those legal instruments were not in place, or they simply weren't recognized for some kind of political reason. Then we know that often the study of all things refugee, it begins with people who've already crossed an international border, following the legal definition. And Rowan and I, and some of our earlier work, had that character. Our work had that character. But it's unsatisfying because there's often an arbitrary distinction between the internally displaced person and the refugee, of simply who was able to cross another kilometer worth of territory to be able to get out. And then, of course, it leaves all kinds of people who, for different reasons that Rowan will talk about in a moment, are not able to move, even if they would like to move if they could. Then there's a singular focus on the so-called durable solutions of return, of resettlement, of local integration in a so-called country of first asylum. These are state-centered solutions to the issue of refugees being out of place in a global system of states. But we know that from the lives of many refugees that they have ties that cross those borders, that often they want to continue to move across those borders in certain ways, or maintain engagements. And one of the things that we try to do is to highlight those kinds of issues in the penultimate chapter. And then at an academic level, there are so many studies of a particular stage of displacement, for example, of asylum or of resettlement. And that's fine. We always have to put boundaries around any particular study. But what it means is that often the connections among those different stages are forgotten. So just to give you one quick example, we know that very few refugees are resettled. Fewer than 1% of the world's refugees have ever been resettled in the last, several decades. And yet the promise, which is often sort of a false promise, that one might be resettled, the hope of being resettled, is a way that people are disciplined in a transit country, which might turn out to be their permanent place of residence. So looking at those connections, or the fact that a lot of integration happens before someone ever leaves a transit country. So a lot of integration into Canada or Australia or the US doesn't happen when they step off the plane at JFK. It started happening in the Philippines, maybe several years earlier. And so anyway, looking at these kinds of connections, we see things that would not be obvious if we were just focused on one stage. Next slide, please. So in the book, we try to answer the problem that's been posed with siloed knowledge production by proposing this systems approach. And we are definitely not the first ones to propose some kind of systems approach. In fact, this is a notion that comes out of the study originally of internal migration in Nigeria from the geographer Akin Mabagunje, A number of scholars in the sociology of international migration have developed systems theories of migration. But what we try to do to add value is to build on those theories and bring them systematically, if you will, into the study of forced migration. So that's what we do in chapter 1. We then move to who was a refugee. We talk about all of the different issues around categorization, self-categorization, legal categorizations, hyper-constructivist categorizations, realist categorizations to define who was a refugee. Then we look at how the legal refugee regime was created. And in doing so, we take a pretty different approach than standard legal histories. We don't start in 1951 with the convention. We don't start with the League of Nations in the 1920s. We start much, much earlier and uncover through the work of other scholars, many different almost forgotten sources of laws around asylum and refugees coming from anti-slavery, political extradition laws. We highlight the vanguard role in both diplomatic and territorial asylum in South America, 30 years before the League of Nations instruments. So it's a rather different historical account, including uncovering what was, to me, completely novel to see specific references to refugees and legal provisions for refugees in U.S. Law, not in U.S. immigration law, but in other features of U.S. law, going back to the late 18th century. So the idea that the refugee regime was something created in the 20th century is rather misleading in many ways. Okay, then the chapter 4 looks at should I stay or should I go? It looks at decision making. And this is where we have a longitudinal case study of one Syrian family. Rowan will talk in detail about that. And we talk about what are the conditions that inhibit or promote movement at particular stages. The chapter on exit, I think, is really important because this is where we bring in insights from conflict studies about the various state logics of demographic engineering, ethnic cleansing, economic projects, the strategies during times of war of non-state combatants as well as state combatants. Why is it that governments are sometimes trying to expel populations or trying to keep them locked up, and everything in the middle of that continuum? And hosting in the mini global souths, we talk about the wide array of policies in different contexts of the global south. What are the state logics of hosting? What are governments trying to accomplish when they create their policies in interaction with policies in more powerful countries and in countries of origin? The chapter on powerful hosts, again, looks at why did have all these governments in places like Germany and the United States, Canada, Australia, UK, why have they done what they've done? Not simply as a moral story, but to explain, for example, what were the specific advantages of giving preference to people fleeing communist countries. Some of those were obvious to shame their enemies during the Cold War, but it's also because the communist countries were restricting the outflow, and it was possible with fairly low-cost symbolic acts to grant asylum because not many people were being allowed to leave in the first instance from places like the Soviet Union and its allies. Then in chapter 8, we look at the transnational connections. I referred to this earlier, as well as homeland ties all the way to return. And then we finish up with the conclusion. Next slide, please. So one of the characteristics of a systems approach, any kind of systems approach, is to take seriously the notion of feedback loops. What is a feedback loop? It's where you have outputs from some kind of process, which then become inputs into related processes within the system. So that's kind of an abstract definition. What does that look like at a less abstract level? Well, for one thing, we chart using specific examples how early labor migrations become pathways for refugee movements, which in turn structure subsequent labor migrations and family reunification. We look at how policies that were created in the distant past, often and with a particular political goal in mind, have long lasting legacies of many, many decades. and then how the decisions of governments today reinforce those policies. And so they renew again the relevance of a policy which in some ways was responding to a rather different set of circumstances. Maybe most prominently in terms of understanding the truly global nature of the system, we show how when governments block mobility in one circuit for whatever reasons, maybe they're racist reasons, for example, to think of some particular examples we use in the book, then that generates flows very far away, and often in really over short periods of time, we see redirections of flows to the other sides of the planet. And then finally, we talk about cycles of policy diffusion, the way that governments are not simply examining a case in front of them and deciding what is the best way to deal with this case based on our own national circumstances. They're also looking at what other countries are doing. Those policies are then transferred, if you will, but always with some kind of tweaking that changes them. And then sometimes those boomerang back to the government that started the initial policy in the first place. So, I apologize if that some of that sounds a bit abstract, but we flesh all of these out with specific historical examples in the book. Next slide. So this is truly a global effort. We look at how these kinds of experiences, movements, policies reverberate around the world, and how the global North and the global South together they mutually constitute this refugee system. That we could debate what is the global North, what is the global South, the merits and demerits of using that framework, but fundamentally these are frameworks that highlight power, different kinds of power, military power, economic power, ideological and political power, and we chart how those kinds of flows of power, such as around colonialism and post-colonialism, have again these long-lasting legacies. Decades, maybe centuries later, we can see their effects. Next slide. So we do draw from a truly global universe of cases, both historically and across space. Some of these cases are going to be well known to most readers, such as the case of people from Syria who have sometimes been besieged, or sometimes become IDPs or become refugees, asylum seekers, and so forth. We also talk about cases that have often been forgotten. And we do this because it shows the utility of approaching this not simply with a legal definition of who is a refugee, but thinking, well, if we have this particular sociological definition of people who, at least in large part, are fleeing violence and persecution, then you can start to see how even in a quintessentially labor migration, like Mexican migration to the US, there are episodes of important refugee flows. And that's what you see in the image here from more than 100 years ago of what today we would definitely call refugees fleeing a lost battle in Mexico and going to El Paso, where there was a refugee camp. And the Red Cross was registering people and conducting a kind of refugee status determination. So we do that, although the focus of the book analytically in its more sustained way, and in the chapter on should I stay or should I go, is the particular Syrian family that Rewan will introduce after she talks about our chessboard of mobility and immobility.
So how do we put all these things together? We introduced this chessboard in chapter 2, but it really helps this encapsulates or captures what we do throughout the book. Oftentimes when we're thinking about displacement, we hear about refugees being compared to economic migrants. Maybe there's an expansion in terms of a continuum of displacement, but with this mobility-immobility chessboard, we use a matrix to really expand that further. So we look at both the degrees of movement and the degrees of coercion. And in doing so, we map out this matrix that allows for acknowledging variation across this graphical representation. First, I want to start by orienting you to think about degrees of movement. So the first 2 columns here indicate domestic movement, so movement inside a state. The second 2 columns look at international movement, crossing a state border. And then we've also reserved this last column to talk about international return. So here, international return is conceptualized as the highest degree of movement. Now, to fill out this matrix, we start off with the lowest degree of coercion and the lowest degree of movement, and we've called this box a voluntary non-migrant. Most of the people in the world are voluntary non-migrants. These are people who stay. They just stay where they live. So we will anchor that by saying least coercion, least movement. Now, if we move along this continua of movement, we can think of an internal migrant, somebody who is not coerced to move inside the state and yet is still moving inside the state, or an authorized migrant. Now we have someone who's crossed an international border, but has not experienced coercion. And if we move a little bit further and consider maybe some coercion, maybe some vulnerability tied to legal status, we can also think about an unauthorized migrant. These boxes essentially capture much of what's discussed when scholars talk about international migration. So if we're thinking about bringing the disciplines together and bridging across the silos, we might imagine this as the realm of scholars who are working on international migration. Now let's think about degrees of coercion. So now we're thinking about people who cannot move, but are experiencing coercion. This could include people who cannot exit, which we talk about extensively in the book, and in doing so, theorize about immobility as we are also theorizing about mobility, people who are besieged and targeted and in hiding, and people who are killed at home. So again, putting together immobility and violence into the center of the conversation about forced displacement as well. Moving forward, now let's think about who we usually talk about when we're discussing forced migration, which could include people who are IDPs, so still inside the state, internally displaced because they have experienced violence or coercion, people who are refugees in open camps. And then within this context, we can also move up and down thinking about levels of coercion. So this might include people in closed camps, including asylum detention centers, or people who have been granted asylum or granted resettlement. So therefore they may be experiencing less coercion in their daily life, but still moving further. Here I'd like to point out that we aren't suggesting that the spaces between these boxes are equally distant, but still trying to track this continuum. So now we've essentially put together what we think about usually as refugee studies in conversation with international migration. We've also created a space to talk about return and refoulement, and considering all the ways in which return can either be coerced, like through deportation, pressured return, and voluntary return. Beyond that, we also continuously bring in conflict and the role of violence across the different degrees of movement. So this includes not only people who are killed at home, but people who may be killed in transit, killed crossing a border, or killed upon return. Now, by bringing conflict studies, refugee studies, and international migration together in this matrix, it also gives us an opportunity to theorize further about forced migration and forced immobility as well, more broadly. So this would include prisoners or people who are internally relocated, transported slaves, and indentured servants. With the time that I have remaining, I want to show you how we can operationalize this chessboard further. I'll just give you a moment to take that in, and we will return to this image in a moment. And so one of the goals of the book is to bring together conflict studies, international migration, and studies of forced displacement. And we do that by bridging studies across that matrix. We also systematically think about what happens when we move from considering refugees or migrants only as individuals, which is often how they may be viewed by the state, and instead thinking about how they see themselves and how they make their own decisions as members of families. So refugee decision-making appears throughout the book, and we're putting together this bottom-up conversation with the top-down by also thinking about how their decisions are shaped by the limitations imposed upon them or the opportunities created by states or forms of global governance. So we systematically move from the individual to the family level of analysis when thinking about refugee decision-making, and we call this the new economics of displacement, building off of foundational theories on new economics of labor migration in the study of international migration. One point to make here is that traditionally this has been about cost-benefit analysis in terms of labor migration, but here we also take into consideration the risks associated with violence and coercion and how they end up shaping people's decisions in tandem with also economic calculations as well, which, as we know, play into everyone's lives, whether you are recognized as a refugee or not. We build on a study of the Osfour family. This is a pseudonym. And here is a pedigree to show you everybody who is in the family that we talk about. So the circles represent the women in the families. The square represents the men in the family. As you can see, the black squares and circles represent members of the family that have remained in Syria and have been unable to leave for various reasons, which we talk about in the book, while the white circles and squares represent people who have been able to cross a state border and have been recognized as refugees. The shaded square and circle includes a couple that has been resettled to Canada. And so by moving from the individual to the family, we theorize about how they end up making decisions on a family level and how those decisions are shaped by states and the limitations and opportunities that are presented there. Now we can map out the Osfour family's experience onto the mobility-immobility chessboard, which allows us to do a few things. One, we can think about how people move forward and backward, or can move throughout this chessboard. So they're not necessarily just labeled as at a single moment in time. Here we discuss Wajih, who is the main interviewee. We've been conducting interviews since 2016. He starts off as a person just living in Syria, becomes internally displaced, finds refuge in Zaatari camp, eventually is resettled to Canada, and recently has been able to gain access to citizenship in Canada. So Wajih went from all of these different categories to now somebody who has citizenship and the opportunities associated with that. Half of his family, as you saw in the pedigree, have crossed the state border and currently live in Jordan. Because they live in Jordan, he has an opportunity now as a Canadian citizen to help facilitate their resettlement. And in fact, he recently heard that his brother's resettlement is now in the process. So his brother will be joining him in Canada very soon. But the other half of his family remains internally displaced. They did not cross the state border at a time when they could have, when the border was open, and for various reasons were stuck in Syria. In fact, his father was living in a besieged, or was living in an area that was under ISIS control. And so therefore he was unable to leave. And in fact, some of those his interactions with his father have been limited by that. So he can't resettle his father, and he can't resettle members of his family who are internally displaced. And now his brother is thinking about seeking asylum, and he turns to Wajih to ask him, should I seek asylum? Should I go through the Libya route to Europe? And Wajih is now, with all the information he's had as somebody who has been resettled and gone through that, is encouraging him not to go to Lebanon in order to go to Libya, in order to go to Europe. And they're still trying to find a solution. And of course, all of these people across the chessboard are making decisions that are informed by the violence that they've experienced as individuals, as members of this family. His sister was killed, and as members of this community that have seen what's happened throughout the years. And so in doing this, we can use this chessboard to understand how people's experiences change over time, how their legal categorization can change, and how people exist not as individuals in this world, but within a network in relationship to their families. And this creates both opportunities and limitations on their movement and the decisions that they make. And so we carry the Osfour story throughout the book, and it has informed much of our analysis beyond just the historical and contemporary cases. And we thank you so much for your attention. And it's such a pleasure to be able to share this with you. If you would like to access the sample chapter, feel free to hold your phone up to the screen and follow this QR code. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to our organizers and our discussants.
Thank you both very much. That was a wonderful walk through some of the kind of key concepts that underpin the book. I particularly like the move away from the individualized approach to thinking about refugees, which is incredibly Eurocentric in the way in which it plays through into policy and also media narratives. You see it particularly in the case of young men who are traveling across Europe. And I really like, of course, the way in which it breaks down the categories, which, as important as they are from a legalistic point of view, are very problematic when we try to understand refugees as being whole human beings, not simply defined by their movement. So really appreciate the overview. It's certainly given, it's always interesting to see also what authors choose to highlight, I suppose, in their presentation. And I thought the chessboard, the way you presented it visually and moving, was a very effective way of capturing some of that complexity. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to hand over to our respondents to sort of give their reflections on the book, perhaps on the presentation, which obviously is new to them as well. I want to introduce them each together at the beginning and then hand over to them individually. So I'll do that now, if that's okay. So first of all, welcome Zachary. Zach Al-Shalmani is a Syrian scholar who researches the intersection between governance and asylum policy. Zach has worked in Europe and in the Middle East with humanitarian international organizations such as the International NGO Safety Organization, Norwegian Refugee Council, and the European Parliament. He holds a BA in Liberal Arts and Sciences from the University College in Freiburg, an MA from the European University Institute, and he's currently a fellow at Oxford University and a doctoral fellow at the UN University Merit in Maastricht. And it was a pleasure to meet you recently, Zach. I'm very happy to have you here with us today. Next up, we have Tamaras Bukhari, who's an associate professor in the Department of Politics and Science at Aalborg University in Denmark. She's also the scientific advisor to the Quechua at Sciences Po in Paris. And prior to joining AAU, Tammy was an associate professor at the Lebanese American University and director of the Institute for Social Justice and Conflict Resolution. She was also a visiting professor at the University of California in Berkeley. We've got plenty of migrants in our midst, I think, on this particular call. Tammy's currently a co-investigator in the multidisciplinary GCRF-funded Rights for Time project, which tries to shift the discourse and practice of humanitarian protection by exploring how time conditions war, displacement, and violence. And again, I think that resonates with some of the points that were being made by our presenters. And last but not least, Dr. Madeleine Garlick is Chief of Protection Policy and Legal Advice in the Division of International Protection at UNHCR headquarters in Geneva. Lovely to see you again, Madeleine. She was responsible for UNHCR's liaison to the EU institutions from 2004 to 13. She's also served with the UN in Iraq, in Cyprus, and in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And she's worked with the Migration Policy Institute and the Open Society Foundations on research and policy analysis. And Madeleine also teaches on an occasional basis at both Po and is qualified as a barrister and a solicitor in Victoria, Australia. It's a real pleasure to have the three of you here with us. I know we're going to have lots to talk about, and I'm going to be really strict and insist that you try and limit your remarks to maybe 8 minutes, 10 minutes maximum. But I hope that when we have the Q&A discussion session, we'll also have an opportunity to bring you back in if possible. So thank you for being here. Zach, can I hand over to you first? Really happy to see you here and look forward to your remarks.
Thank you very much, Heaven, and thank you for inviting me. And thank you for David and Rowan for writing this brilliant book, which I have really enjoyed reading. It was perfect, especially in a time where we feel that there is a level of skepticism, or which is even developing into cynicism in relation to refugees and refugee studies, especially with how it's being reported on in the media, at least from here, from Europe. I'm originally Syrian. I grew up my entire life in Syria until I had to make the unfortunate trip to Europe. And of course, like every single person, there's all of the phases that people have to go through. And it was brilliant to see the chessboard. And I was really trying to draw my path on the chessboard at some point. So thank you very much for that. And also for highlighting the fact that there's a lot of people who cannot move, and that many of the refugees who have moved have very, very deep emotional connections with, and that they will continue to try to get them to move no matter what. So it's a bit of, this gets me to what I want to reflect on, which is your recommendations for practitioners in the field, which I thought were brilliant, but also I really thought that I could also link them to different areas of research that can be of interest. So the first one was the role of agency of refugees. A lot of academics have been looking at the role of refugee preferences, refugee agency, and so on. And this can come in handy in terms of refugee matching, for example. What would certain groups of refugee want versus what can be offered? So this is a bit of the lowest common denominator, that is the idea. However, the problem in here that I was reading was balancing the interests of refugees with the interests of all the receiving states, or at least if it can be, and I was really thinking about how this can be done and how this is a big issue in most of the matching algorithms that we are using at the moment, whether it's on national governments or whether it's international. So this was the first thing that came to mind when I was reading, that refugees have significant agency that is very limited, but when given the opportunity, it can be practiced. Of course, this kind of agency can be utilized. So for example, this kind of conditionality is used in Germany under the Königsteiner Schlüssel, which takes away the freedom of movement within Germany until a refugee is able to obtain a job, education, or find ground for family unification. So it goes back to this carrots and sticks that you've mentioned before, and when are they effective, when are they not? In the German case, this was an effective carrot that, you know, learn the language, get a job, you will regain your free movement afterwards. And this is actually one of the topics that I'm researching for my PhD. So enough with the self-advertisement. The second area that I wanted to reflect on was the production of knowledge, which you've brilliantly discussed. You discussed the silos and everything. But then when I was reading the second chapter about who is a refugee, and you know, you lay it out very well between, you know, the legal definitions, the realist definitions, the limited definitions versus the a bit more open definitions that can be a bit more inclusive. And here something came to my mind. It's simply, you know, okay, this is the theoretical, but when I put it to practice, when I just test every refugee who applies in different countries, what are the rates of accepting and not accepting? And there's a recent book by Kahneman, who it's called Noise, the Flaw in Human Judgment, which he does mention this. He does mention that the fact that there is very high noise in the refugee system, that is the international system, it reduces the trust of refugees in this. I spent 2 years in Turkey, never have I thought about going to the UNHCR. No disrespect, but the community was saying, well, it's not illegitimate, or the noise is too high, at least in how they make the decisions. It can be also in countries. So I was also wondering how this fits within the new economics of displacement. So it's about limiting as well, as you were saying. And the third and final point that I wanted to touch on, because I know there's a lot to discuss, so I don't want to monopolize the discussion, is building public support. And this is a topic that when Heaven and I met, we talked a bit about it, because she was showing us in Maastricht about how certain British newspapers report on asylum seekers and refugees. And when I first saw it, I was like, oh, this is easy. Let's sue them for slander. They showed the faces of these people. I was like, okay, let's do some strategic litigation. But then you know, there are some groups that are doing it, but then this is not enough. If this is being allowed, tolerated, if not encouraged to portray refugees in a specific way, then I feel that, you know, leaving it to the courts becomes a bit of a political failure. That yes, we've decided, we've voted to drown the refugee and burn the witch. Now let's go to the court to see if that is allowed or not. So with these three, with the building public support, I believe, at least on the EU level, with the new EU Media Freedom Act, which is a law for the times we live in, not the time that we wish to live in, at least how it's being described in the EU, because it's a bit impeding on some member states that are controlling the media too much. And then I was thinking, how can the UNHCR, for example, push on this front that this can be included in an EU Media Reform Act, in a reform that's saying, well, you know, also this kind of this kind of publication or this kind of viewing of refugees that can be harmful, that we know causes harm, not just in perception. You can slander me all you want, but when my visa is rejected because you slandered me, it's something else. So I really think there is a lot to be done on the policy front, on the media front, and of course it comes all together in understanding, you know, refugeehood and refugeedom. To summarize now, what I think the EU has been, you know, in relation to the book, to the refugee system, or what the EU's refugee system, the consequence of the current EU refugee system is. And you do mention Greenhill and the weaponization of refugees, weapons of mass migration, and so on. But what I think is happening now, at least in the EU, that has to be addressed because of the failure of the refugee system, is that weaponization is happening both from outside and inside. From outside, you have states trying to push refugees on the EU, but also from inside, you have states in relation to refugee policy, they're threatening to veto whether foreign policy decisions or so on. And this is an area of research that some professors in Maastricht were working on. But I wanted to mention that, yes, the current refugee system is very unsustainable. So the question is, to what extent, how much harm is it causing, both to refugees, which is the vast majority, but also to the states that are receiving them? And I was wondering if you can have some kind of thinking about how can we, even though, you know, how can we match the interests of the states with refugees, to go back to the initial matching idea? Because I do believe that at least in Europe, whenever there are surveys or public opinions or so on, people usually have a positive view towards refugees, a less positive view towards climate migrants, a way less positive view towards economic migrants, at least in terms of perceptions. And so I was wondering, how can we move from here? Thank you very much, and looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Zach, and perfectly on time. Didn't even have to wave my sign around too much, which was very helpful. I think this point about, you know, the kind of public discourse is very critical in all of this. And I think potentially one of the very useful things about the book is that it does again move us away from those silos, which often juxtaposition one deserving against one undeserving group, when in fact, as we see from the chessboard and we know from research, the people move between categories very often because that's the nature of that experience. So I hope at the end we'll have time to come back to Rowan and David to get some responses to your points, because I think they were very important. What I'll do in the first, though, is just hand over to Tammy. And Tamris, you're very welcome to make your comments, and please be as punctual as Zach in your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heaven. Thank you. I'm really delighted to be here, and I'm thankful for the opportunity to reflect on Rowan's and David's book. So I would just like to take a few minutes to talk about the merits of the book, which I enjoyed so much reading. I'd particularly like to elaborate as an academic on the systems approach to displacement that you develop, and why this approach is key to breaking down some academic and policy silos that, according to me, prevent us from seeing the bigger picture, and that keep us also trapped at times in the same logic of governmentality. So I think that the book really develops a captivating narrative by bringing insights from the journey that people make and from broader power relations at the heart of the global asylum or refugee system. So what I found particularly compelling is that rather than looking at the global refugee system through the lens of fragmented logics of governance, you just do an amazing job at bringing in personal biographies, political geographies, policy cycles, as well as historical legacies together, and showing how they really build on each other. And you powerfully illustrate how these interrelated policy feedback mechanisms, you know, shape refugee realities on an everyday basis, whether they are in the global north or in the global south. And these interrelationships remain at times massively overlooked in academic work and policy models. So my question is, how does the book reshape the way we think about the refugee system? And how does it introduce a new perspective on governmentality in the realm of displacement? So I would just like to put forward 3 arguments. So first of all, I thought that the book questions fundamentally how we understand displacement. So oftentimes we ascribe a lot of importance in our writing to one particular refugee group. We emphasize ethnic or national belonging or specific frames of reference. And this prevents us from understanding really how refugee struggles are built upon prior refugee struggles or on overlapping waves of displacement. So let me give you a concrete example that's very much inspired by my own research. So much literature looking at Lebanon's politics of reception towards displaced Syrians, does so through a siloed approach, ignoring how precursory, ongoing, but also overlapping waves of displacement from Palestine to Iraq shape Syrian refugee trajectories on the one hand, but also Lebanon's logic of governmentality on the other. And this argument also applies to policy, not only to academia. And let's take Jordan, for instance. So I'd like to refer to the EU-Jordan Compact of 2016, which promises trade concessions to Jordan in exchange for the Hashemite kingdom to grant 200,000 job permits to Syrian refugees. So in this context, the compact, which devises formal employment opportunities only for Syrians, has created a lot of tensions with other refugee and migrant populations. For instance, Iraqis expressed a lot of dismay as to why they were not included in the compact's arrangements. So did Egyptians, who constitute the largest migrant labor group in Jordan long before, Syrian refugee flight. So from this perspective, I think the book really behooves us to think about the bigger picture. How do we transcend the ethnic, the nation-centric lens when we want to understand histories, policies, but also, intermeshed vulnerabilities that shape refugee journeys? And so a more complex question, how do we integrate diverse mobilities, plural connections, and transnational refugee struggles while still making case of our case study? And I thought that this is a methodological challenge that I'm confronted with, and that, not only refugee policies, but also critical refugee studies, as Zach said, are yet to fully grapple with. So the second merit of the book that I'd like to talk about, and that specifically speaks to my own research, is the following. I think that the book does an amazing job at advancing, what geographers and political scientists have called relational thinking, or relational comparisons in the way we think about various locations and geographies of displacement. And namely, when we think about refugee policy making in the so-called global north and refugee policymaking in the so-called global south. In some instances, we are led to think that refugee policymaking in the global south and in the global north are two distinct phases, locations, and that they are two separate things. We are also led to think that states that have signed the 1951 Convention do a better job at respecting refugee rights than non-signatory states. So the book calls us to really rethink and to break down all these factitious boundaries between refugee policy making in the global north and in the global south. Something that I think, and I think many would agree with me, that policy making and at times academia have sought to artificially maintain and reify. So this means that, according to your the amazing spectrum of examples you've given, that you behoove us, or you call us to kind of analyze that when we look at policies shaping displacement, we often ignore how they are built on cooperative containment or on a relational architecture of repulsion, if I may borrow some of the taxonomies you use, and that draw really on this relational thinking between the North and the South. We often ignore how a seemingly straightforward policy, such as a mobility partnership within the EU or a mobility agreement, is built on restrictive containment strategies elsewhere in other geographies that remain peripheral and obfuscated in our own analysis. And this point has really spoken to the heart of my research. So I think that if we look at a certain policy pertaining to displacement, without thinking space and entities relationally, we miss out on how asylum regimes and norms co-constitute each other. And you do an amazing job at really, showcasing this. So I think this is one of the greatest merits of this book. And, when you argue that the seemingly generous reception policies of certain states is only possible because it co-depends on containment and repulsion elsewhere. This also, makes us rethink the global refugee system, but also what you referred to, Zach, the EU kind of refugee system. So how do we kind of, recast those categories, those kind of containment strategies, methodologically, conceptually, but also empirically? So I guess that when we ignore in our analysis these policy feedback mechanisms or these policy diffusion effects that you conceptualize in the book, we end up being locked into a territorial trap. And we are very much, incapacitated in our endeavor to reimagine the international refugee regime beyond what it is right now. And so when I read the book, I asked myself all of these questions, and this kind of like triggered my own thinking about how can I reimagine the international refugee regime through these policy feedback mechanisms, through this relational thinking that you beautifully unpack in the book. So the last merit that I would like to highlight is the book's convincing approach to defining refugeeness beyond the legal dimension. So the book manages to shift the gaze from restrictive legal definitions of refugees to the actual lived experiences and aspirations of refugees themselves. It reminds us that individuals fleeing war challenge and dismantle labeling statuses on an everyday basis, either by escaping such legal categories or by assigning themselves, other self-ascribed or imagined identities. So the book made me really think of this following dilemma. How do we account for refugee self-identities and for refugees' ability to challenge bureaucratic labels, while at the same time ensuring that the 1951 Convention is not emptied of its meaning and that its content is not diluted? And your book confronted me, such a kind of conceptual challenge. So in one of our research missions lately, displaced Syrians in Jordan, whom we talked to, argued that ascribing the definition of refugee seems for them at times dehumanizing. In other situations, it emerges as empowering because they can use it in order to negotiate rights, access to health, access to housing. So how do we grapple with these situational variations? And how can we as policymakers, but also academics, of course, better attune ourselves to refugees' fluid self-identities? And your book confronts us with such a task. So I'm going to stop here in the light of time constraints, but I just want to emphasize that I would not hesitate a second, not only to adopt this book in my class, but also to draw on the refugee system approach to develop my own research. Thank you for including me in the discussion.
Cameras, thank you very much. Those were three very important points, and I think very well and eloquently made. So I'm very grateful to that. I mean, I think this thing about silos, and it's a recurrent theme in the book and in the presentation and in your comments and those of Zach, is really, silos, we kind of don't see the connections between things, but they're worse than that in a way, because what they lead to is sort of competition over resource and territoriality over who is responsible for what, and how do we, how the challenge to us, I think, in the system is how to bridge across the different areas, particularly humanitarianism, protection, peace as well, the security issues, and get people talking to one another around those issues. And I think there are things happening in the UN system that try to do that. Certainly the Development Coordination Office, I think, tries to do that. The resident coordinators try to do that, but there's a long way to go in actually moving away from those territorial policy silos, I think, which may or may not be a good point on which to bring in Madeleine, because obviously you're speaking from the perspective of one of those UN agencies. So Madeleine, I'd really welcome and be interested in your thoughts and reflections on the book. The screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Heaven. And really, let me also express sincere appreciation for the opportunity to be here. It's such an honor to be involved in this discussion with the panelists here and to speak to your book, Rowan and David, which really is an extremely significant piece, I believe. It challenges established ideas and approaches in the way that the best academic work should do. And it's a very welcome and I think timely contribution to the scholarship in this area. I think it's timely when we look outside and see that we're at a moment now where there's significant numbers of refugees displaced worldwide, although as the book notes, not unparalleled or unprecedented numbers, but it is a moment where protection and solutions remain elusive for too many. So we really need to be challenged in our thinking and in our work in all spheres of the refugee discussions in order to see how we can find better ways forward. I also think that the systems approach described in the book is an extremely valuable contribution to thinking. And I think it helps us to really appreciate and recognize the complexities of today's refugee context and the need, therefore, for commensurate nuances and shades of understanding in responses to them. The importance of a comprehensive rather than a siloed approach to addressing refugee protection and access to rights is more needed now than ever. I think it's also, I'd like to talk to a couple of trends that I see, which I think highlight some positive movement away from siloed approaches in some areas, although they aren't sufficient as yet. And I hope that with this book and the discussion that I anticipate it will generate, we can see further progress towards that in policy making and in the design of responses in the practical and operational realm to refugee issues. So the first point I'd like to address here is indeed the one that both Zach and Tamaris have also touched upon, the focused on the legal definition, which is seen as being dominant in many studies. I guess there's a certain logic to focus on legal definitions in legal studies in particular. And of course, one of the strengths of having the clear legal criteria we have in the 1951 convention that are built upon and expanded upon in the African Union and Cartagena contexts is that they are a gateway to rights. And so in any discussion about how we need to look beyond these legal categories, I think we can't lose sight of the central importance of ensuring that states recognize that there are obligations that are owed directly to people who fall within those categories. But beyond that, I couldn't agree more that in order to improve the effectiveness of responses which are not adequate to the complex patterns of human movement today, we need to be looking beyond those categories. But I think it's positive to see that even in legal debates, we are seeing a broadening of the focus. We see increasing recognition of the importance of looking at categories of people who need international protection, but who fall outside the constraints of the 1A definition of the 1951 Convention, people who have rights not to be returned based on international human rights law, people who are entitled to complementary, to subsidiary, to other forms of protection. It's interesting to see that we have, for Ukrainians today, of course, invocation of the temporary protection regime in the EU, which obviates the need for people to go through individual status determination, giving them immediate access to territory and to protection. And this is something which we at UNHCR hopes will underline the value of such approaches in other settings in future, so that people are not forced to await the outcome of inefficient bureaucracy and too demanding refugee status determination processes in cases where their needs for safety are urgent and pressing. What I think is also important in this sphere is to see that we are positively seeing an increasing recognition also of the need to speak about refugees and migrants in the terms that the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants of 2016 did, and which we see certainly, I think, in some of the UN and wider multilateral fora as giving us a welcome focus on the importance of looking at people on the move more broadly and focusing efforts on trying to ensure that the rights of all people on the move are respected regardless of their legal status. And this, I think, is allowing some of us in this field to bring together a larger group of allies to the table and seeking to tackle phenomena including overuse of immigration detention, the need to identify people in vulnerable situations, to look at people who are at risk of trafficking and smuggling, and in ways that highlight the urgency of trying to respond effectively to these people's rights and needs without being tied up in legal categorizations. A second point I'd like to take up is the book's discussion of the perceived excessive focus on durable solutions, notably the three so-called traditional durable solutions: voluntary repatriation, local integration, and resettlement. And here I think, of course, it's worth recalling that these have a certain value because they come from the UNHCR Statute of 1950, which was endorsed by the General Assembly. So we have the benefit of being able to put states in front of their obligations again and point to the importance of them honoring their commitments to facilitate access to these solutions for refugees. But they're not enough. And that's the reality we see today. They are just not in reach for too many refugees. So today, I think it's good that we're seeing an increasing focus on other approaches to solutions, complementary pathways, referring to other lawful migration channels, including family unification, labor migration, opportunities for pathways to study and others, where sometimes refugees simply aren't able to access these because of lack of documentation or because of excessive fee or other bureaucratic requirements, where there's increased investment of efforts to ensure that refugees can access these channels and in many cases use them to be able to fulfill their potential to contribute in really important ways, including to host countries. I think it's important, this connection, to see the way in which the role of development actors is increasing more focus. This week in Geneva, we had the High Commissioner's Dialogue on Protection Challenges, which focused on development. And so it was really excellent to see a much wider group of participants there discussing issues around how development assistance can be brought to bear as part of one of those conversations that you referred to, I think, Heaven, looking at the nexus between humanitarian assistance, peace, and development work in ways that are not hopefully going to make this just into a discussion about money, but recognize that it's in the interests of all states as well as of refugees and indeed host communities to do development planning with refugees factored into the picture. And I think also in this area, in looking at solutions, I think the book focuses on a really important point about mobility more broadly, that beyond arriving in host countries, we need to be looking at ensuring that refugee mobility can be facilitated. And this, I think, really reflects some of the origins of what the refugee protection regime aimed to do. Article 28 of the convention talks about convention travel documents, and this is something which is crucial. Refugees need to be given travel documents so that once they get access to safety, they can then go on and travel and work and fulfill many of their ambitions in other ways. And I was gratifying a couple of years ago to be involved in the development of an EXCOM conclusion on machine readable convention travel documents, because that's what refugees need today if they're realistically going to be getting access to visas and to travel worldwide. I think Article 31 of the Refugee Convention actually highlights that refugees have a right to move, and they have a right to move irregularly without being penalized. So I think we must continue in discussions on this to pick up this point that the book makes, that once refugees get access to safety, that should not be the end of their journey. They need to be able to move freely, as so many others do in today's world. A third point I'd like to point to is the issue that was taken with the problem seen where there's no specific explanation of displacement. And there is a point taken particularly as regards UNHCR's global trends, where it said that UNHCR fails to explain or purposefully neglects the causes of displacement. And I think I'd perhaps like to query that, because the global trends, in particular, in UNHCR statistical publications more broadly, are perhaps not the place in which we can most usefully see that kind of analysis, which is a crucial one. There's enormous expectations placed on UNHCR to produce these figures several times a year and to give a picture of where we stand on displacement trends. And I think were we to invest in painstakingly analyze its causes multiple times a year as those publications come out, then we wouldn't be in a position to respond to the clamor, including from academia, to furnish that. But I would perhaps highlight that there are a number of documents that UNHCR does produce, notably its eligibility guidance and country guidance documents, which go into extreme detail about conditions we see in countries of origin. UNHCR issued this year a guidance note on the international protection needs of people fleeing Afghanistan. Last year, we issued the 6th update of its protection considerations with regards to people fleeing Syria. We've also issued this year documents on returns to Ethiopia, returns to Gaza, addressing specifically the situation of Palestinians, who are a particularly important group of refugees. And in the pipeline are documents coming on DRC, Nicaragua, Colombia, Afghanistan, and Iraq. And that's all in 1 year. So if there is, I think, indeed interest in seeing what UNHCR says about the causes, that's where you can find it in enormous detail. So finally, perhaps I can just point to the issue about production of knowledge and agree with the other discussants there that this is a critical issue. And for me, what this highlights is the stark urgency of involving more refugees and other people who have lived experience of not only displacement, but also of persecution and violence and conflict in all of its form, to enable them to be researching and writing in this sphere. And this isn't just about ensuring they have places on the podium at events like the Global Refugee, the Global Refugee Forum next year and the High Commissioner's Dialogue, where I was glad to say we had many refugees taking the floor. But also it's important to ensure that we can make available access to scholarships, to research funding, that there are platforms and academic networks to which refugees and others can get access as well. So that's something that HCR is also seeking to do, but like so many other areas that are addressed in this book, there's a long way to go. Thank you very much and really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Madeline. Again, many interesting and relevant points. I mean, I think this issue about durable solutions is very interesting. As you say, it's a sort of way of holding states accountable for their commitments under international refugee law. But I have to say, I'm personally a big fan of Francois Cropot's approach, which is, mobility as a fourth solution, essentially, because in reality, what you're then doing is harnessing the ability of people to move and their capacity to move to places which ultimately are often places where they already have existing connections, for example. So yeah, I think
we need both.
I think we need both, exactly that. So thank you all. We don't yet have many questions in the chat or the Q&A. I would encourage those that are still with us, please, to do write up your questions. We have a point about how quickly can people get hold of the book, and especially for those that are trying to teach courses on this. I know Raman and David, there's a bit of a delay, I think, on some of the distribution, and people are very keen to get hold of the book for their courses. So if you're able to, in the chat to everyone, put any links that might be helpful in terms of how people can get hold of copies, how they can get hold of review copies, that would be very helpful, I'm sure, to those that are in the audience. That would be very useful. Beyond that, whilst we're, sorry, David, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, so as I understand it, the book has actually been shipped. It's available from the UK side, and it should be shipping in North America this month. According to Amazon, I'm not suggesting you buy your book from Amazon, but according to Amazon, it ships the first week of January in North America.
That would be great. That's good to hear. Whilst we're waiting for people to type up their comments or questions, I wonder whether either of you authors have any responses to the comments that were made by our speakers, either on specific points or generally. I mean, people are very positive about your book, which is always nice at a book launch. I mean, I have been in book launches that aren't so positive, but is there anything in particular by way of the points that were made that you'd like to respond to while we're waiting for anybody else? Rowan, do you want to go first?
Sure. First, thank you all so much. It's, of course, this is the launch, and this is really one of the first times that we've been able to engage with people who've read the book like this in such a format. And so that's just really wonderful. Thank you. Thank you to each of you. A lot of fabulous comments and insights, and I would love to go through them one by one, but I suppose my first thought in reflecting is just how oftentimes when there is an intervention to address challenges associated with one population or one issue or one country, there's an unacknowledged other population that often essentially, by not being included, can also there can be negative effects on that population. And so, I was just thinking about putting all the comments together. And actually, I think, Tammy suggested this when she was talking about Zach's comments as well, is if we're focusing on the EU, then we can try to find solutions within that system. But in doing so, might also neglect how solutions that support the interests of states and the movement, and even people, right, who have become asylum seekers or asylees in the EU may end up affecting people in the global south. So thinking specifically about how offering work permits to Jordanians is a form of local integration, so supporting this durable solution that we talked about, but in supporting a durable solution for a particular population that in turn limits the movement of asylum seekers or tertiary movements, let's say, beyond staying in the global south, can have these negative effects on Iraqis or ex-Gazans in Jordan and things like that. And so even from, so I'm very intrigued by thinking about the positives that come of of what we have. So thinking either about durable solutions or this bridging of development and durable solutions, and really interrogating the boundaries of that. So if we begin by acknowledging that by prioritizing a certain population or a certain state's interest, that there are these other effects, asking ourselves what are those effects and who is affected, and then going from there, sounds like a good and straightforward juncture to push the conversation forward, while not letting go of the really important interventions that so many people have worked to develop. So that's kind of where my mind was going in response to all of these. I also was thinking kind of along these lines in terms of what Madeline was saying about specifically global trends, and saying, global trends is not the place to go if you want to see the UN take up these issues. And what a fair point that is. And it also made me think about how, as academics, maybe we need a better literacy of navigating UN documents as well. And that seems like a very concrete and straightforward suggestion that these conversations can lead to. I mean, even having the whole list of what's been produced in terms of guidance notes, I think would be a great thing to link to that. And so in terms of knowledge production, I suppose the point to make is it's not just about what's produced, but about how it is received and then interpreted and then reproduced. And so I think that puts the onus on the person who is taking in that information as well. So it's not just to critique the knowledge producers, especially the practitioners who have these responsibilities towards people and certain limitations, and whether they're political or even just practical, right? In terms of trying to produce or trying to create these reports, the onus then becomes on us. And what I hope the book can help do is push us to think beyond, like, how do we interpret this, and then how do we put that into the larger conversation? And yeah, so I'll leave it at that. David, what have you been thinking about? Thank you all so much for these comments.
Well, what I was visualizing when I was listening to Madeline and to Heaven offer a few examples of the way that this kind of silo bridging is underway, I was visualizing the Owl of Minerva flying at dusk. And if that's true, no one would be happier than me. I think probably everyone on this call shares that interest in seeing more of those kinds of connections. I want to address one of what I would say is the hardest question that has been posed today, and it was a question that we posed to ourselves, and that came from Temi, when if I can just rephrase the way that I interpreted one of your points, is that, how can you do a study of a particular case, however you want to define that case, without studying all human history, all times and places? And if the approach requires everyone to write a 500-page book that begins to do that every time they talk about refugees, then that's not a very useful approach, right? It's asking people to do too much, it's impractical, etc. So if I can just plug Rowan's work here, I mean, her book derived from her dissertation is a case study of how the Jordanian state and non-state actors operating in Jordan and IOs operating in Jordan do that. I'll let her talk about her own work, but it's basically taking a systems approach and showing how it works in the case of a particular country. The takeaway for other people thinking about these issues, though, that I do think is practical, is to at least ask yourself, when you have a case that might be legitimately bounded to one particular group of people, or to a particular time, or to a particular country, for example, and just ask yourself the question, what would be learned by drawing a connection to these other stages of displacement, for example, or by thinking of what might the historical feedbacks look like, or what if my definition of refugee that I'm using, and there are many legitimate definitions that one might adopt. We're not proposing a single one of them. We've cataloged the different ways that people talk about these things, but what could I learn if I used one of these other definitions? Just ask the question. The answer may be, in a particular study, not so much, or not enough to make it worthwhile to pursue that line. But we would like others to join us, because we've learned a lot by asking ourselves these questions over the last decade. And I just think that there is a lot of richness to be had if we would do that regularly.
No, I think they're very good points, well made. I mean, I guess the thing that is resonating in my mind as I'm listening to you all speak is, breaking down silos also has its own challenges, right? I mean, not just in terms of getting rid of the silos, but how you then know about other things when those silos no longer exist. I say this partly because it's been a huge learning curve for me joining the UN system and discovering, for example, this HDP nexus, the work that's going on in relation to humanitarianism, development, and peace. There are things that I knew absolutely nothing about, having been in the area of refugee studies for 30 years. That's quite frightening to me, that actually you become very, even if you kind of try to stretch out your knowledge and your engagement, there are still these huge worlds of other people operating in these spheres with real meaningful on the ground engagement with refugees in terms of all sorts of aspects of protection and integration that literally I knew nothing about. So I think it's all, and then how do you then become familiar with all those areas and be up to date with them? So it kind of it's certainly raising for me other kinds of challenges, I think, in some way. Madeline, you had your hand up in response to that. Do you want to come in, and then I'll bring in a question from the audience?
Thank you, Heaven. No, I think these are really interesting exchanges also, and Rowan's kicked us off perhaps. This all speaks, I suppose, to all of us trying to ensure fewer silos between academia, UN, policy fora, and others as well. I said how glad I was to be invited here today, and it really is an opportunity.
I think we've lost you, Madeline. You've gone on mute. Just unmute yourself. Thank you.
There, I'm back on. I think, yeah, no, I think it's really exciting to hear some of these reflections, and I think, indeed, the point David makes about raising this question, how do we look at specific groups without looking at many others? I think this is an area where perhaps it would be good to reflect on how academia could really feed into some of the more important learnings and reflections that the UN world needs, I think. I mean, we're particularly bad at historical perspective, I think, in part because of the pace at which work needs to be done in emergency context, partly because we have rotation policies and because people move around the world all of the time. So I am going to be encouraging various colleagues to be reading this book, and it makes me think we need to find better ways also to be able to have policy dialogue with this perspective in it. It makes me think that the Global Compact on refugees, which of course it has its strengths and weaknesses, but one of the things it does talk about is the importance of a multi-stakeholder approach to addressing refugee challenges, and I think that's an important part of really this non-siloed approach that you're espousing. And so perhaps we think of ways in which to bring this in more systematically to some of these processes linked to the compact, to both of the compacts, and how they are seeking to move things forward. Thank you.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the whole of society and whole of government approach, we certainly would aspire towards it. I think the challenge is making it happen. But yes, certainly it would is something that captures that idea of, not just simply limiting migration policy or refugee policy to Home Affairs or another department typically has dealt with those issues, but seeing it as a whole of government approach. We have a question, and then I'm just going to very quickly come back to Tammy and to Zach. But the question comes from Lucy Schramm. Looking forward to reading the book to dive into these topics in more detail, especially to read more about the Asfour family and their journeys. For those of us who are not as well versed in refugee scholarly work, what is one idea or concept you hope we take away after reading the book? So that's clearly for David and for Rawan. What do you want people to take away from this discussion today? That's a tough one, I know.
You know, one of the things that I would like people to take away is that this idea of mixed flows, which has two different components, the idea that you have two groups of people or several groups of people who are moving for fundamentally different reasons together in the same space, or people who have multiple motivations to move, maybe a combination of violence at home, or that they want to be able to, you know, buy food to eat and so forth, or reunite with a spouse or child. That idea is nothing new at all. And we often see the claim in pretty prominent places that mixed flows is a new phenomenon. And we see this going back to the very earliest forms of people who were called refugees, to the Huguenot refugees, you know, fleeing France in the 16th century, all the way to people leaving the Eastern Bloc countries to come to the West. And so I think that's important. It gets to the danger of only using the legal definition, and I'm not hostile at all to the legal definition. Again, I think that if someone's doing refugee status determination, they have no other choice than to use the legal definition, and that's really powerful. But in terms of public representations of these issues in the way that they're frequently reported in the media, you know, avoiding this idea that there are some people who are very clearly refugees and everyone else is not, has, you know, it has a negative consequence. And so it's not so much that I think that the legal machine has to be different, as I think the public communications machine and media representations and academic representations need to not hide from that fact, because that's the real world we live in. And to the extent that we try to shove that under the rug, then we'll lose credibility, because that is the world that we live in. That's how human beings have many needs.
Yeah. I'm going to come back to you in a minute, Rowan, if I may, but Zach is nodding furiously, so I really want to offer him the screen, because I know he has something to say on this. And then I'll come back to Tammy, because the question from the audience sort of relates to something you said. So, Zach.
I'm sorry, I'm just usually very expressive all the time, and people always think that I have something to say, but the problem is I always have something to say. So at least on this one, I do have something. I really believe that some of the information being shared about refugees is at best misinformation, at worst intentional disinformation. And I really think that if we cannot address this by the law, because we failed on the politics. I study governance, so I see relations between politics, the law, the economy, society, and so on. And here, you know, we have a legal system that has failed for obvious reasons, but also we failed on the political front as well. And in many areas, the way it is being discussed, it only encourages it to kind of fail even more. And this is why I'm wondering, how do we come out of this vicious cycle? Because when you have two areas that are going down and down and down, with both the law and politics turn against refugees, I feel that we're selling our values at this point, that we're saying, well, yes, we'll only do the things that make us feel good. And somehow I feel, if it's the last thing I would say, is there are some civil society, NGOs and so on that are suing these states to say, hey, listen, you signed this, you claim this, we cannot implement it through the UN or through another system, and now they're taking different routes. So if you ask me, I see more light in the legal direction than the political one at the moment, but I would really like to know if there are other ways, because of course, yeah, but I'm sorry for over nodding.
No, not at all. I mean, I think there are multiple different ways in which these things can be addressed, and it's kind of bringing those things. It's not that there's one single or singular approach, that would kind of defeat the object of the book by the sounds of it in any case. So, but thank you. I'm going to ask this question from the audience. It mentions you, Tammy, but you don't have to necessarily answer the question. I'll come back to Rowan perhaps because it relates to the book. But the message, the question is from Blair, or the point is from Blair Sackett, and he says, "Congratulations on such an important book. I echo Tamaris's excitement about the relational perspective you take. I was wondering if you could say more about the importance of this approach, and how does taking a relational approach to displacement, a policy between the global north and the global south, further our understanding?" So I wonder whether, Tamaris, you might say something about that because you raised it in your comments, and then maybe Rowan, you want to say something. And then unfortunately, we're already running out of time. So we'll take some short comments and then we'll draw to a close. So Tamaris.
Yeah, thank you so much for this great question. I'm gonna just give maybe a simple example that from my own research, and which is about this relational thinking, in the Euro-Mediterranean, and more specifically, how the logic of the so-called refugee crises relate to each other. And more specifically, I have been investigating in the last years how, securitized refugee policies in the Mediterranean, cannot just be looked at through methodological nationalist lens, but offer really a transcalar discursive site whereby the EU's acute securitization of the so-called refugee crisis in 2015 has had reverberations beyond its borders, providing a rationale for Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and Turkey also to further securitize their asylum policies. And so in this particular perspective, if you just look at, asylum policies or securitization policies or what have you, without really kind of embracing this relationalism and understanding these policy slippages or feedback mechanisms, then we are really ignoring the crux of the matter, or we are unable really to account for how asylum systems and refugee policies co-constitute each other in a certain geography beyond borders, beyond nation states. And I think that this is one of the most promising approaches that the book calls us to rethink that, and I won't hesitate a second, to build on this systems approach in my own research, to further those insights and to show why this relational thinking is very important to transcending a lot of the binary thinking that really, inhabits the way we do research, the way we do policy making.
Thank you, Tammy. I really wish we had longer to talk about this. I have to say, I could quite happily sit here for another hour or so chatting about these things. I think they're really important, not just, obviously in relation to the book, but kind of more broadly. I think they're really important in how we approach the work that we do, which many of us have been involved in for a long time. However, we are running out of time, unfortunately, and we've covered the questions in the chat. So I wonder really whether I could come back to the two authors, maybe Rowan, particularly in that question in relation to kind of the relational thinking, but really to ask both of you just to sort of a couple of minutes to sort of, say whatever you want to say in terms of what you want people to come away from with this book, but also, any further reflections on the discussion that we've had so far. Rowan and then David.
Thank you to our audience members for these great questions, to Lucy and Blair and Tammy and Zach also for responding to some of these questions too, and also Madeline early on. I suppose if I'm trying to put them all together, my first thought was thinking about how asylum seekers in 2015 and 2016 were talked about in the media as compared to refugees who were crossing state borders. And there was this kind of underlying sense that refugees who were crossing state borders, they were more deserving of making that movement, and that they kind of belonged in the global south, while asylum seekers who were coming to the shores of Europe were in some ways doing something that was pushing the limits of liberalism. The expectation was, sure, where do refugees belong? They belong in the global south. And I think that when you talk to people on the ground, including officials who are navigating this and people who are responding, that there's a different conversation than what we saw in much of the media that I was consuming, at least from the US perspective. And I start with this example because I'm thinking about how these words of refugee versus asylum seeker, which have very legal consequences, also have these very social consequences and are in and of themselves capture a kind of relationality between how we envision people have the right to access certain territories. And so I think that's a good example of leakage from legally consequential definitions to shaping much of the worldview, let's say, at least in the ways that it's represented in the media. And so I think when we consider how the interests of the global North play out in governance in the global South, where the vast majority of the world's refugees live, even after the mass displacement of an estimated 7 million Ukrainians, right? We can better understand how these cooperations work and how the ways that we might consume knowledge about it reinforces this division, when the division is, there are so many ways to see connection beyond geography, right? And we see that play out in refugees' daily lives and in terms of just the governance and their access to resources and rights. And so I think maybe that's at least one way to constantly hold ourselves or look for ways to hold ourselves accountable to not reinforce these divisions at moments when it's not necessary, and move beyond siloed knowledge production and instead think about how this really is a global regime.
Absolutely. Beyond siloed knowledge production and also beyond the kinds of categories that are ultimately politicized. Then, you know, categories don't just exist as a sort of like vessels into which you put people. They serve their purposes. They bound in the way that Tamaris was describing. In order to have some people in one category, you've got to have somebody outside, essentially. There's a juxtaposition to that. So thank you, Rowan. David, I think you get the last sort of word, if you like, not in the world, but it's certainly in terms of this conversation in the interest of time. So just any closing thoughts or reflections?
Sure. I'll quickly pick up a comment that Zach had made about matching the interests of refugees with the interests of states, because two of the chapters about the hosting in the global North and in the global South focus on what are those state interests. And I think it's really important to, at a policy level, to be clear-eyed about the many different state interests, sometimes positive interests towards particular groups of refugees. And in terms of demographic engineering, for example, to replace people who have been killed in wartime, such as France did quite aggressively after World War I, or for reasons that normatively I might not like so much, but for projects of ethnic and racial religious engineering, for example, we can see lots of examples of that, simply trying to generate economic growth using refugee workers. And all of those, just having a systematic understanding of why governments have not always tried to keep out refugees, but have often tried to attract them or accepted them, I think is useful. And it points us also to policy solutions that may have been forgotten because they took place some decades ago, but they're still alive. So looking at some of the League of Nations arrangements around refugee workers, around resettlement, the Nansen passports of mobility, kind of the precursors of the Article 28, I believe it is, provision that Madeline mentioned. I think these are also useful policy models today. We've also mentioned the importance of making sure that refugees are part of the conversation, not as window dressing, but in substantive ways. And the history that we recount in there is replete with examples of that. So, a refugee, Jacques Rubinstein, being one of the drafters of the convention in the 1930s, right? The 36 was it, the League of Nations Refugee Convention. The first commissioner of the UNHCR himself having been a former exile in the UK during the war, of various other ways, or scholars, people like Aristide Zolberg, who hid from the Nazis in Belgium as a boy, or Hannah Arendt, refugee scholarship being extremely influential in shaping things. So it's sometimes I get the sense that we're always trying to reinvent the wheel, but it's a very grim history in these pages, but there are some positive notes. even going back, I'll just close with this because Madeline is joining us from Geneva. The first refugee resettlement program that I've ever heard about was Brandenburg sending officials to Geneva to recruit the Huguenots, or at least some of them, to move into the Protestant German-speaking provinces. So, in any event, I am very grateful to all of you for your comments, and you were very generous in your comments. But if you have more critical comments, we look forward to engaging those as well, because this is not the final word. None of these things are ever the final word. We're all working on these issues. There's always more to say. So we look forward to that critical discussion as well.
Excellent. As I say, I think we could have continued the conversation much longer, but really very grateful to both of you for giving us this opportunity to showcase, or at least start to showcase, some of the work. I really enjoyed your presentation. Really grateful to Madeline, to Zach, and to Tamaris for your comments and your engagement, not just on this event, but more broadly. These are as David just said, these are not issues that are kind of going to finish at this time. They're going to continue the conversation onwards, and we would very much at UNU-CPR be very happy to be involved in those conversations, either as a host of events or as a way of sort of facilitating some discussions between different UN agencies or member states. So please bear that in mind. We will, and thanks also, of course, to Jack and Jacob behind the scenes, who are recording this event and managing it, and we'll make it available very soon so that people can reflect on some of the discussions. Very grateful to you all, and hope you enjoy very much the rest of your evenings, days, or afternoons, depending on where you are again, and really look forward to staying in touch. It's been a pleasure.